He was sold when he was 8 years old, not kidnapped in the night, not taken in a raid, sold by men who had captured him on the Crimean steppe and decided he was worth more as property than as a problem. He was tall for his age, strong. One eye had a cataract that clouded the iris. Some buyers considered it a bad omen. His first master sold him again because of it. His second master saw something different. He was taken to Egypt, given a horse, a bow, and a set of instructions that would consume the next decade of his life. He learned to ride before he had finished growing. He learned to fire a composite bow at full gallop, to read terrain like scripture, to move an army through darkness without making a sound. He learned everything there was to know about war, and nothing else. By the time he was 30, there was almost no one alive who understood warfare the way he did. His name was Baybars, and in the winter of 1258, a message reached him in Cairo that changed the calculation of everything. Baghdad had fallen. Not just fallen, ceased to exist. The Mongols had spent 7 days inside the city, the House of Wisdom, the greatest library in human history. 500 years of accumulated mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy had been thrown into the Tigris River. So many books that eyewitnesses said you could walk across the water on the floating pages. The river ran black with ink for days before it ran red with blood. The Caliph, the spiritual leader of the entire Islamic world, the man who had believed until the final hour that God would not allow his city to fall, was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. The Mongols did not spill royal blood directly on the ground. They had a rule about that. They had no rules about anything else. Somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people died in those 7 days. The streets were so thick with bodies that the Mongol horses had difficulty finding footing. A scholar who survived wrote afterward, "I saw the end of the world." He was not exaggerating. Baybars read the report and understood what it meant, not just for Baghdad, for everything. The Mongols had been moving west for 40 years without losing once. Not a battle, not a campaign, not a single war. From the Pacific coast to the borders of Poland, everything they had pointed themselves at had fallen. Empires older than memory, armies that outnumbered them, cities whose walls had never been breached. And now Egypt was next, the last major Islamic power left standing. If it fell, there was nothing after it. Baybars had one advantage over every commander who had faced the Mongols before him and lost. He already knew what it felt like to lose everything. He was not the only one. Baybars was not an unusual case. He was not a singular tragedy. He was one of thousands of boys taken from the Crimean steppe, the Caucasus Mountains, the plains of Central Asia, purchased, transported, and delivered to Egypt to be turned into something their captors could use. The system had a name, Mamluk. The word meant owned in Arabic, and the men who ran Egypt in 1258 had built their entire military foundation on it. Here is how it worked. Merchants traveled the steppe routes and the slave markets of the Black Sea coast looking for specific boys. Not any boys. Boys who were tall, strong, quick, the kind of physical material that with the right training could become something extraordinary. They were purchased young, 8, 9, 10 years old, at an age when the mind is still forming, when identity is still soft enough to be reshaped. They were brought to Egypt, converted to Islam, given Arabic, given horses, given bows, given a decade of the most intensive military training in the medieval world. A Mamluk training manual from this period describes what was expected. A warrior must master 32 methods of lance combat, 17 ways to strike from horseback with a sword. He must fire 15 accurate arrows per minute while riding at full gallop. He must read terrain the way a scholar reads text, instinctively, completely, without having to think about it. He must trust the man beside him, without hesitation, without doubt, without ego. That last line was the point of all of it, because the Mamluk system was not designed to produce individual fighters. It was designed to produce units, men bound together not by family or tribe or nationality. All of that had been stripped away, but by the specific, unbreakable loyalty of people who had survived the same thing together. Boys who arrived as strangers became brothers through shared suffering. They had nothing else. They were allowed nothing else. The system made sure of it. When they came of age, they were freed, not returned to their families. Those were gone, unreachable, years in the past. freed into the Mamluk military hierarchy, where rank was earned through skill and nothing else. No bloodlines, no inheritance, no titles passed from father to son. You rose because you were better than the man beside you, or you didn't rise at all. It was, in its way, the most brutal meritocracy in the world, and it had produced Baybars. He had arrived in Egypt with nothing, a cataract in one eye, a reputation as a bad omen, already sold twice before anyone saw what he actually was. What he actually was became clear quickly. He was not just physically gifted, he was a strategist. He could look at a battlefield and see things other commanders missed. He could move men through darkness silently. He could make a retreat look like panic and an ambush look like open ground. He rose through the Mamluk ranks not because anyone gave him anything, but because no one could stop him rising. By 1250, the Mamluks had done something that should not have been possible. They overthrew the dynasty they served. The Ayyubid sultans, descendants of Saladin, rulers of Egypt for generations, were gone, replaced by their own slave soldiers, men who had been property deciding they were done being property. Baybars was part of that. He understood power the way men understand things they have never had, completely, obsessively, with no illusions about what it cost. Which brings us back to the report from Baghdad, because the Mongols were not just an army, they were a demonstration, a 40-year demonstration of what happened when a military force optimized everything: discipline, mobility, intelligence, psychological warfare, and then refused to stop. Genghis Khan had built the machine in the early 1200s on the Mongolian steppe. He had understood something that rulers in stone palaces consistently failed to grasp. War was not about glory. It was not about honor or lineage or the will of God. It was about results, about making sure the other side could not get back up. His army had no infantry to slow it down. Every man rode. Every man had been on a horse since before he could walk properly. Every man carried a composite bow, layers of wood, horn and sinew bonded together and left to cure for years, that could drive an arrow through armor at 200 yards, while the archer was riding at full gallop. An entire army of mounted archers who could cover 60 miles in a day and fight at the end of it. They had a system for terror too. When a city resisted, it was not merely defeated, it was erased. In 1221, a Persian city called Merv refused to surrender. The Mongols took it and spent 2 weeks killing everyone inside. Historians estimate over 700,000 people died. The survivors were so few they had to hide in the ruins, living among the bodies of their families for months before anyone found them. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was calculation. The news of Merv reached the next city before the Mongols did. That city surrendered without a fight. So did the next one, and the one after that. Terror became the weapon that arrived before the army. Cities that had never seen a Mongol soldier opened their gates because they had heard what happened to cities that didn't. By the time Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, arrived at Baghdad in 1258, the Islamic world had been watching this machine move west for 4 decades. They had seen the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in Central Asia, dismantled in 3 years. They had seen Russia conquered, Poland invaded, Hungary devastated. The Mongols had never lost because every time they faced a new opponent, the opponent made the same mistake. They fought the Mongols on the Mongols' terms, in open ground, where Mongol mobility and coordination turned any numerical advantage into a death trap. Baghdad made the same mistake. The Caliph believed God would intervene. The walls would hold. The faithful would be protected. The walls held for 2 weeks. After Baghdad, there was Damascus. Damascus fell without the walls even being tested. The city opened its gates and hoped for mercy. After Damascus, there was Aleppo. After Aleppo, there was Gaza. The Mongols were at the edge of the Sinai Desert. Egypt was 1 campaign season away. Hulagu sent envoys to Cairo with a letter. The message was simple and had been delivered to every city that came before. Submit completely, immediately, or face what Baghdad faced. The Mamluk Sultan at the time was a man named Qutuz. He had come to power recently, in the specific chaos of a dynasty that overthrew its own rulers and had not fully stabilized. He was capable, he was experienced, but he was not Baybars. He read Hulagu's letter and called a council. The council argued for hours. Submit, said some. "The Mongols are too powerful. Look at what happened everywhere else. Every army that fought them is gone. Every city that refused them is rubble. What makes Egypt different?" Qutuz listened to all of it. Then he had the Mongol envoys executed. Their heads were displayed on the gates of Cairo, facing north, toward the army that was coming. There was no going back from that. Both men understood it. Qutuz had just told the most powerful military force on earth that Egypt would not kneel. Now someone had to make sure Egypt could survive that decision. Qutuz turned to Baybars. Baybars had been waiting for exactly this. Not this moment specifically. Not this sultan, this city, this particular letter from a Mongol general demanding surrender. But this kind of moment. The kind where everything that had been done to him, the selling, the training, the decade of being shaped into something useful for other men's purposes, finally pointed in one direction, and that direction was forward. He accepted the command. Then he did what he always did before a battle. He went to look at the ground. This is the thing about Baybars that the other commanders who had faced the Mongols never fully understood. They thought war was decided on the day of the battle. He knew it was decided weeks before, in the terrain, in the approach routes, in the specific geography of the place where two armies would collide. The Mongols had beaten every force they had ever faced on open ground, where their cavalry could sweep and flank and execute the feigned retreats that had broken armies from China to Poland. The answer was not to meet them on open ground. Baybars rode north into Palestine. He was looking for a specific kind of place, not a fortress, not a city, a valley. He found it near a spring called Ain Jalut. The name meant Spring of Goliath. Local tradition held that this was the ground where David had killed the Philistine giant, a boy with a sling against a warrior in full armor, the underdog winning because he refused to fight on the stronger man's terms. Whether the tradition was accurate didn't matter. The geography was real. The valley was narrow. Hills rose on both sides, covered in dense scrub. The approach from the north funneled any large force into a confined corridor where the ability to sweep wide, to flank, to execute the coordinated maneuvers that made Mongol cavalry unstoppable, all of it would be useless. It was a cage. It just didn't look like one yet. Baybars rode back to Cairo and laid the plan out for Qutuz. It would work like this. The Mamluk army would march north, not defensively, forward, into Palestine, toward the Mongol force. Aggressive movement. The kind that would look to Kitbuka. The Mongol commander left in charge of the Western campaign after Hulagu withdrew east for the succession crisis, like an army that didn't understand what it was walking toward. Then Baybars would take a forward force into the valley, visible, exposed, a target that looked too good to ignore. He would engage the Mongols just hard enough to make the fighting feel real, then retreat, not in panic, in precise controlled movement that looked like panic. Draw Kitbuka's force deeper into the valley, deeper and deeper, until the hills on both sides were full of Mamluks waiting in silence, and there was nowhere left to go. It was the Mongols' own tactic, the feigned retreat, the move that had lured armies to their destruction across 40 years of conquest, turned back on them by the one commander alive who had studied them long enough and carefully enough to understand not just what they did, but why it worked. Qutuz listened. Then he asked the question any commander would ask: who leads the forward force? Baybars answered before the question was finished. Qutuz looked at him for a moment, not with doubt. He was past doubt. The envoys were dead, and the army was already forming, with something more complicated than doubt. The specific expression of a man who understands that the person he needs most is also the person he cannot fully control. He held Baybars' gaze for just a second longer than necessary. Then he nodded. This was the specific genius and the specific danger of the plan. The forward force, the bait, would take the first full impact of the Mongol charge. They would have to absorb that hit, hold formation, fight convincingly enough that Kitbuka believed he was winning, and then retreat in controlled order while being pursued by cavalry that had spent 40 years perfecting pursuit. Too fast, and the retreat looked planned. Too slow, and the force was simply destroyed before the trap could close. It required the kind of nerve that very few men had, and it required a commander the troops trusted completely, trusted enough to follow into something that looked from the outside indistinguishable from suicide. The army marched north in July 1260. They crossed Sinai. moved up the coast. And here, in one of the stranger details of this entire story, they passed through the territory of the Crusader states, the Christian kingdoms that had been fighting the Islamic world for 2 centuries. The same kingdoms that some Mongol commanders had been attempting to court as potential allies against Egypt. The Crusaders let them pass, not out of sympathy, out of calculation. They had watched what the Mongols did to Baghdad. They had watched Damascus fall. They understood that a Mongol victory over Egypt would not leave the Crusader states standing as some kind of tolerated neighbor. It would leave them as the next problem to be solved. The enemy of their enemy was not their friend, but he was, for the moment, more useful alive than dead. Baybars noted this, filed it away. He noted everything. The Mamluk army camped briefly outside the walls of Acre, the great Crusader port city, one of the most heavily fortified positions in the region. The Crusaders fed them, allowed them to resupply. Some of the Crusader lords reportedly came out to meet Baybars personally. They looked at this man, pale-skinned, one eye clouded, quiet in the way that very dangerous people are quiet, and made their assessments. He made his too. The army moved on, into Galilee, into the hills of northern Palestine, where the valley of Ain Jalut sat waiting. Kitbuka knew they were coming. His scouts had tracked the Mamluk march for weeks. He had approximately 20,000 men, a formidable force, veterans of the campaigns that had taken Baghdad and Damascus, men who had never experienced defeat. Hulagu's departure had reduced the overall Mongol presence in the region significantly, but Kitbuka had not adjusted his confidence to match the reduction in his numbers. He had no reason to. The Mongols had never lost. He moved his force south toward the valley. On the night of September 2nd, 1260, the Mamluk army made its final preparations. Qutuz positioned the main force, roughly 12,000 men, in the hills on either side of the valley. Hidden, silent, they had been in position since before dawn, forbidden from moving, forbidden from making any sound that might drift down to the valley floor. Baybars took the remaining 8,000 into the valley itself. He rode along the lines in the darkness. He didn't give a speech. He didn't invoke God or glory or the memory of Baghdad. He had one instruction, and he gave it once. Hold until the signal, then retreat like your life depends on it. He paused, because it does. The sun rose over Ain Jalut on the morning of September 3rd, 1260. The valley floor was quiet. The hills above it were not. And somewhere to the north, Kitbuka's army was already moving. Kitbuka saw what he expected to see. A Mamluk force arrayed in the valley, banners up, visible. 8,000 men sitting in open ground with hills on both sides, and nowhere obvious to go. To a commander who had spent decades reading battlefields, it looked like an army that had made a mistake, walked into terrain that limited their options and didn't know it yet. He ordered the advance. The Mongol cavalry came down from the north in the way they always came, fast, coordinated, the composite bows already drawn. The first volley of arrows arrived before the two forces were within 400 yards of each other, a wall of sound and movement that most armies had never learned to absorb without breaking. Baybars held. He had prepared his men for this specific moment. The first volley always felt like the end. It was designed to feel like the end. The Mongols had learned over 40 years that armies broke not when the arrows hit, but when the sound of them coming created the certainty that death was seconds away. The psychological impact arrived before the physical one. Baybars had told his men this. He had told them the arrows would come and the world would feel like it was ending, and they would hold anyway. They held. The two forces clashed in the valley. It was not the kind of fighting that looks clean from a distance. It was close and fast and brutal. Lances, sabers, the specific chaos of two elite cavalry forces meeting at full gallop. Dust rose in columns thick enough to turn. The morning light brown. Men disappeared into it and came back out bleeding or didn't come back out at all. The noise was beyond description. Hooves, steel, the short, sharp sounds men make when something punches through them. Baybars fought in the front of it, not directing from a distance. In it. This was deliberate. His men needed to see him there. They needed to know that what he was asking them to do, he was doing alongside them. He had taken an arrow in the early minutes. Not deep. It caught the edge of his armor and skidded rather than penetrating. But he felt it, filed it away, kept moving. A Mongol rider came at him from the left, cutting through the dust at full gallop. Baybars turned his horse into the charge rather than away from it. A counterintuitive move, closing the distance before the rider could adjust his angle. The Mongol's lance passed wide. Baybars's saber did not. He was already moving to the next target before the rider hit the ground. This is what the training had made him. Not a man who thought about fighting. A man who had trained for so long that the thinking and the doing had collapsed into a single motion. There was no gap between seeing a threat and responding to it. The 30,000 hours of drilling on the practice fields of Cairo had removed that gap entirely. The fighting lasted long enough to be real. Long enough for Kitbuka's scouts on the flanks to report back that the Mamluks were engaged, pressing, taking casualties. Long enough for the battle to feel like a battle rather than a setup. Then Baybars gave the signal. His men began to pull back. Not in disorder, in the precise, controlled rhythm he had drilled into them for weeks. They fired as they retreated, turned in the saddle, loosed arrows, turned back, kept moving south, kept the formation tight even as they appeared to be breaking apart. It looked like collapse. To Kitbuka, watching from his command position, it looked like exactly what he had seen dozens of times before. An army losing its nerve. The moment when the Mongol reputation stopped being abstract and became physical. When men who had believed they could stand suddenly discovered they couldn't. He ordered the pursuit. The Mongol force surged forward. The entire momentum of the army, 20,000 men moving at full gallop, committed to the chase. They poured into the valley after Baybar's retreating force. Deeper, the hills rising on both sides, the corridor narrowing, the space to maneuver shrinking with every 100 yards. Kitbuka was good enough to feel it before he saw it. Something was wrong. The retreat was too controlled. The Mamluks were pulling back in formation, not scattering. The flanks of the valley were quiet in the specific way that things are quiet when they are full of people trying not to make noise. He began to pull up, tried to slow the advance. Too late. Kutuz gave the signal from the hillside. 12,000 Mamluk cavalry came off both slopes simultaneously, not in a single charge, in coordinated waves, hitting the Mongol flanks from multiple angles at the same time. The valley that had looked like open ground became a closing fist. The same force that had seemed to be fleeing in front turned and charged back into the Mongol vanguard. The Mongols were surrounded on 3 sides with the valley walls on the 4th. What followed was not the kind of fighting that produces clean narratives. It was dust and noise, and the specific terror of an army that has never been trapped discovering what trapped feels like. The Mongol formations that had executed complex flanking maneuvers across 3 continents had no room to execute anything. The cavalry that had outmaneuvered every force it had ever faced was compressed into a killing ground, where maneuver was impossible. The valley floor became a single heaving mass of men and horses, swords instead of bows. At this distance, in this density, the composite bow that had conquered the world was useless. The Mongols drew blades they rarely needed and discovered that in close quarters, against men who had trained for exactly this, the advantage shifted. A young Mamluk soldier, 17 years old, on his first real campaign, a boy from the Caucasus who had arrived in Egypt 4 years earlier with nothing, found himself face to face with a Mongol veteran twice his age in the middle of the crush. The Mongol was experienced, controlled. He feinted left and struck right in the way that had worked 100 times before. The boy had drilled that exact sequence 3,000 times on the practice fields of Cairo. He was inside the strike before it landed. His sword found the gap between armor plates at the shoulder. The veteran went down. The boy stepped over him and kept fighting. He did not think about what had just happened. There was no time to think. There was only the next threat and the next and the next, until there weren't any more. This was happening everywhere in the valley simultaneously. 20,000 individual engagements collapsing into a single outcome. The Mongols fought. They were Mongols. They did not break easily or quickly. Kitbuka rallied his men repeatedly, launched countercharges into the Mamluk lines, found gaps and drove into them. There were moments in the middle hours of the battle when sheer ferocity seemed like it might be enough, that 40 years of experience might compensate for the trap. It wasn't enough. Kutuz threw his helmet, not lost it, threw it, deliberately, tore it from his head in the middle of the battle and hurled it away so that every man on the field, Mamluk and Mongol alike, could see his face. A sultan without a helmet was a dead man on horseback. Every enemy archer would target the exposed head. Every man on his own side would know their commander had removed his own protection and was fighting bareheaded in the front of it. It was the kind of gesture that should be insane. In context, it was the only rational move left. The battle had reached the point where tactics were secondary to will, where the question was not which side had the better plan, but which side wanted it more. Kutuz answered that question in the most unambiguous way available to him. His men answered back. Units that had been faltering turned and pressed forward. Men who had been absorbing blows started delivering them. The Mamluk line that had threatened to buckle locked into place and began to push. Kitbuka fought until there was nothing left to fight with. He was captured near the end, brought before Kutuz on the valley floor, surrounded by the bodies of the army he had commanded. The accounts of what passed between them vary. Some say he was defiant, some say he simply accepted what was coming. What the accounts agree on is his final statement before his execution. He told Kutuz that this changed nothing, that Hulagu would hear of this, that the ocean of Mongol wrath would boil over and the hooves of Mongol horses would shake the ground from Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt. Kutuz had him beheaded. Kitbuka's head was put on a staff and carried south, toward Cairo, toward the city that had displayed Mongol envoy heads on its gates weeks earlier and was now receiving the head of the Mongol commander in return. By the time the sun set on September 3rd, 1260, it was over. The valley floor was covered with Mongol dead. Of the 20,000 men who had ridden into Ain Jalut that morning, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were dead or captured. The ground was so thick with bodies that horses had difficulty finding footing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Baybars noted the specific irony of that. In Baghdad, 2 years earlier, the streets had been the same. The Mamluks stood in the valley and understood what had just happened. They had done what no army had done in 40 years. They had faced the Mongols and won. Baybars rode through the aftermath. His armor was damaged. He had wounds he hadn't stopped to count yet. Around him, his men were beginning to understand the scale of what they had accomplished. The noise rising slowly, as exhaustion gave way to something that had no clean name, but sounded like men who had been certain they were going to die discovering they hadn't. He watched Kutuz receive the congratulations of his commanders, watched the Sultan accept the praise that was entirely, completely, undeniably deserved. And somewhere behind his eyes, behind everything else, a calculation was already running. Kutuz had turned to him when Egypt needed saving. The question was what Kutuz would turn to him for now that it was saved. The march back to Cairo began the next morning. 20,000 Mamluk soldiers moving south through Palestine, through the territory of the Crusaders, who had watched them pass north weeks earlier and were now watching them return. The difference was visible. They had gone north as an army, marching towards something uncertain. They were coming back as something else. The men who had broken what everyone believed could not be broken. Kutuz rode at the front. Baybars rode behind him. They had fought together for years, survived things together that most men don't survive once. Baybars had designed the battle, had taken 8,000 men into a valley as bait and held them there long enough for the trap to work, had fought in the front of it, had taken wounds that he was still feeling 3 days later. He had not been given Aleppo. This is the detail that history records without fully explaining. In the immediate aftermath of Ain Jalut, as Kutuz distributed the captured territories among his commanders, Baybars expected Aleppo. He had earned it. Everyone who had been at the battle understood he had earned it. The victory at Ain Jalut was as much his design as anyone's, more if you were being honest. Kutuz gave it to someone else. The reasons are debated. Some historians say it was political. Kutuz was wary of giving too much power to a man who was already too capable and too respected. Some say it was personal. There was a history between them, the complicated friction of two powerful men who needed each other and didn't entirely trust each other. Some say it was simply an oversight, a miscalculation by a sultan who didn't fully understand what he had just done. Whatever the reason, Baybars received the news in silence. He was good at silence. He had been practicing it since he was 8 years old, since the first time he understood that the feelings of property were not something captors needed to consider. He had learned to keep everything internal, to let nothing show on his face that he didn't intend to show. The march continued south, somewhere in the desert between Palestine and Egypt. The accounts are not precise about where only that it happened. Qutuz went hunting. A sultan's privilege after a great victory. A moment of relief after months of preparing for a war that could have ended everything. His guards fell back, not all at once, gradually, in the way that things happen when someone has arranged for them to happen gradually. Baybars rode up beside him. What passed between them in those final moments is not recorded. There may have been words, there may have been nothing. What the historical record tells us is that Baybars struck first. A knife, fast, the way a man strikes when he has decided and does not want to reconsider. Qutuz turned, recognized what was happening, may have said something. The accounts disagree. He died in the desert, the man who had executed the Mongol envoys and declared that Egypt would not kneel, the man who had thrown his helmet into the battle and exposed his bare head to enemy archers because the moment required it, the man who had looked at the most powerful army on earth and decided to march toward it rather than wait for it to arrive, dead in the sand at the hands of the man who had made his greatest victory possible. Baybars rode back to the army. He announced that Qutuz was dead, that he, Baybars, was assuming the sultanate. The army accepted this with minimal resistance. These were Mamluk soldiers, men who had grown up in a system built on the understanding that power moved to whoever was capable of holding it. They had just watched Baybars design and execute the most important military victory of the century. The logic of his claim was difficult to argue with. He rode into Cairo as Sultan. The city that had been celebrating the victory at Ain Jalut was now processing the information that the man who ordered the battle was dead and the man who won it had taken his place. The reaction was complicated. There was grief, there was unease, there was also, underneath everything, a pragmatic recognition that the man now sitting on the throne of Egypt was exactly the kind of man Egypt needed if the Mongols came back. And Baybars understood they would come back. Hulagu was still alive. His army was still vast. The defeat at Ain Jalut had broken the myth of Mongol invincibility, but it had not broken the Mongols. They would reassemble. They would plan their revenge. The window that had opened was not permanent. He spent the next 17 years making sure Egypt was ready when it closed. He reformed the Mamluk military from the inside, tightened the training, upgraded the weapons, built a network of signal towers across Egypt and Syria, a communication system that could carry news from the border to Cairo in a single day, so that no army could approach without being seen and responded to. He established a postal relay system that was the fastest in the medieval world. He drove the Crusaders out. The Crusader states that had watched him march north and calculated that his victory was in their interest, discovered that the man who had saved Islam from the Mongols had no intention of leaving them as a permanent presence on the edge of the Islamic world. City by city, fortress by fortress, he dismantled 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant, Caesarea, Arsuf, Safed, Jaffa, Antioch, each one taken with the same methodical intelligence he had brought to Ain Jalut. He repelled 3 subsequent Mongol invasions. Every time Hulagu or his successors sent forces west, Baybars was waiting. The man who had studied the Mongols obsessively, who had understood their tactics well enough to turn their own feigned retreat against them, was now the standing answer to every attempt to reverse what had happened at Ain Jalut. The Islamic world that had watched Baghdad burn and believed it was watching the end of everything, rebuilt itself under his rule. Cairo became what Baghdad had been, the center of Islamic civilization, the city where scholars came, where trade flowed, where the accumulated knowledge of a culture gathered itself back together after the destruction of 1258. The House of Wisdom was gone. What Baybars built in its place was not a library. It was a state capable of defending libraries. He died in 1277, 17 years after Ain Jalut. Some accounts say he accidentally drank poisoned kumis that had been intended for someone else. Others say he died of wounds from a campaign. The exact circumstances are unclear, and perhaps appropriately so. A man who spent his life in the shadows of power, dying in circumstances that remain ambiguous. He was buried in Damascus, in a library he had built. What happens to a weapon after it wins? It depends entirely on who built it and what they forgot to consider. The Mamluk system purchased boys, stripped them of everything, trained them until the only thing left was the ability to fight and the loyalty to the men beside them. It produced exactly what it intended to produce: soldiers of extraordinary capability who owed nothing to anyone except the brotherhood of the barracks. What it did not account for was this: men who owe nothing to anyone are not controllable. Men who have been stripped of every identity except warrior have no reason to stop being warriors when the external enemy is gone. The system that made Baybars capable of saving Egypt also made him capable of killing the man who sent him to do it. Qutuz understood the Mongols. He did not fully understand what he had built. Baybars saved a civilization. He also murdered the man who gave him the chance to do it. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. History does not offer the clean resolution of one man being the hero and another being the villain. It offers instead the specific, uncomfortable reality of what actually happens, that the qualities that make men capable of extraordinary things are often the same qualities that make them dangerous to everyone around them. The slave who broke the army that destroyed civilizations was not a hero in any simple sense. He was not a villain either. He was what the system made him. The question worth sitting with is not whether he was right or wrong. It is whether the civilization he saved understood what it had asked of him, and whether it ever could have. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Was Baybars a hero, a murderer, or something that doesn't fit either word? The man saved the Islamic world and killed the person who trusted him to do it. History has spent 7 centuries arguing about which of those things matters more. I'd like to know where you land. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more stories like this.